The report is very clear. Competition in the retail grocery sector in New Zealand is not working. Consumers would get better prices, range and quality if there was more effective competition in the sector. The Commission has confirmed that the two major grocery retailers operate as a duopoly, and there is little prospect of new or expanding rivals to achieve the scale and geographic coverage required to compete effectively with the major grocery retailers. In addition, while there are a range of fringe retailers in the market, these are currently only providing a muted impact on competition. The Commission found that there are a number of factors making it difficult for new entrants, including a lack of suitable sites for developments and difficulties for retailers in obtaining competitively priced wholesale goods. The profitability of major grocery retailers is high. New Zealand supermarkets are making more than double what the Commerce Commission considers a fair rate of return on capital for grocery retailing. It's clear there is a problem with competition that needs to be fixed. The Commission's estimates found that return on capital invested by major grocery retailers averaged between 12.7% and 13.1% across the period 2015 to 2019. That's well above what the Commission would expect for a normal rate of return for grocery retailing of around 5.5% under workable competition. Now, even in the most conservative scenario they put forward in the report, and you have to dig into the footnotes to find this, I think it's footnote 101, the report suggests supermarkets effectively are deriving excess profits of around $1 million a day each and every day across New Zealand. The government made a manifesto commitment in 2020 to address the rising cost of groceries and to make sure shoppers are paying a fair price at the checkout. It's especially important as the economy recovers from the impacts of COVID-19. I know there is a desire to see the government act swiftly on this, and I want New Zealanders to know that that will be the case. The government accepts the Commission's findings. Competition is not working as well as it could be in New Zealand. Rising costs of grocery items are top of mind for many New Zealanders who are facing increased costs of living and growing bills at the supermarket checkout. And the Commission's final report makes 14 recommendations, and I'll be working through and considering how each of these could be progressed. But as a first step, the government will commence work on making it easier for grocery retailers to enter the market by providing availability for new sites for supermarkets, and that could involve removing barriers under the Resource Management Act and or prohibiting retailers from using restrictive covenants over land titles to limit competition. Secondly, we're going to commence work on developing a mandatory code of conduct to govern relationships between the major grocery retailers and their suppliers and address imbalances in bargaining power. Thirdly, we're going to be looking at how to establish a new regulator and dispute resolution scheme that would provide oversight of the retail grocery market, including monitoring and enforcing the grocery code of conduct. And fourthly, we're going to be designing a new regime to ensure retailers have better access to wholesale supply. At the same time, there are several recommendations that retailers can implement right now. The Commission directly recommended to retailers that they ensure their pricing and promotional practices are simple and easy to understand, that they make information on loyalty programs and data collection clear and transparent, and that they cooperate with price comparison services. So I've written this morning to the major grocery retailers to ask that they progress these recommendations as soon as possible, and if required, I may explore backstop options to make sure that these changes do happen. The report sets out a clear justification for change in the grocery retail sector. The status quo will not deliver fairer prices for consumers and a better deal for producers and suppliers, and I hope the sector will constructively engage in the changes that need to happen. New Zealanders are paying more at the checkout than most. Out of 38 OECD countries, we're the fifth highest in terms of grocery prices by one measure, And this report makes a serious case for change when it comes to competition in the sector, so Kiwis don't have to pay so much for the basics. As I mentioned earlier, the government will progress work immediately in response to the final report. Some changes, like changes to help Kiwis compare prices and make informed choices in the supermarket aisles, can be made quickly. This will save people money. Other changes, like changes to planning law, will require amendments to legislation. I expect to introduce and progress any legislation this year to ensure changes are made quickly. In the coming weeks and months, my officials will be engaging with stakeholders and analysing the recommendations before we make final decisions on the recommendations to government. It is important for us to have a competitive retail grocery sector that works well for New Zealanders. Consumers deserve to get a fair deal at the checkout. In closing, and before I take questions, I also want to thank the Commerce Commission for its important work on this market study, and I look forward to working through the recommendations to enhance competition in this vital sector. Open to questions.
Can you give us an indication of when you think supermarket prices for groceries are actually going to come down as a result of these recommendations that you said have got your full support?
Well, these things could start happening, some of them, immediately. The supermarkets themselves have committed to changing their pricing practices to make it easier for consumers to make better decisions according to their own interests at the supermarket. That could be happening right away, and the supermarkets have pledged to act early on that. Equally, a number of changes have already come about simply as a result of having this market study. The supermarkets have signed up to banning covenants or making them unenforceable. That was not previously the case. They've signed up to having a code of conduct. That was previously not the case. They are already changing their behaviour, and this should make a difference if they implement those changes quickly. We'll be looking to see that they do.
Around the margins, though, those things won't make a substantial difference when we see inflation at about 6% and the opposition says we've got a cost of living crisis. When will we be able to see a tangible difference in the price of supermarkets, grocery items?
I think change here will occur over time. As I've said, some of it can happen immediately. I mean, we accept the findings of the report. It says the market is not competitive and the conditions need to change. New Zealanders are demonstrably paying too much at the checkout. If the recommendations themselves don't in themselves achieve the result we're wanting to see, then we'll consider other options.
You said you will explore backstop options to ensure changes happen. Can you elaborate on what those backstop options are?
I don't want to go into the detail too far. We have just received the report, but I want to see those recommendations implemented. The report itself, I have had the liberty of reading it over the weekend. It's 607 pages long. It is thorough, and it makes a number of changes. I want to make sure that as we consider the recommendations, that the change we want to see actually happens.
Minister, has the recommendations that came back, are you happy with them? Do you think that they go far enough, or do you think that the Commerce Commission could have been bolder and looked at some of those other options in the draft report, such as splitting up one of the supermarkets?
Look, we accept the findings which say competition is fundamentally not working. Our starting point is the recommendations, and there are arguments for and against, for example, divestment made in the report. What we want to see is the change happening in the competitive conditions. We want to see a material change in the nature of the sector. If that doesn't happen, then we'll look at other options.
Talk about those backstop measures. I mean, what is the time frame you're looking at for that? Like 12 months, 2 years, what?
Yeah, so, I mean, for example, we're looking at those land changes the supermarkets have said they'll do. We want to make sure those things are enforceable. So we want to start that change happening now. I want to have law into the Parliament this year. And that means, if you work your way back, that policy change and the work to make that enforceable have to happen now. Equally, there's nothing to stop the supermarkets implementing most of this change right here, right now, starting today.
Like unit pricing and that sort of stuff.
Unit pricing is a good example. Yep, that can happen now. And supermarkets, in fact, some supermarkets do a good deal of unit pricing. Foodstuffs South Island is already doing a good deal of unit pricing. Others can make that their policy too, and across the sector we can see a more uniform approach adopted.
Minister, on this, we are relying still a lot on the good faith of supermarkets to actually follow some of these recommendations around the loyalty schemes and discounts.
and you talk about these backstop measures, but apart from that, how can we be sure that they'll actually follow through? And do you trust that our supermarkets, when they are making such profits from this industry, will actually make these changes?
Look, I think the disinfectant of sunlight is already upon the sector. I think that's why we've seen them come forward and say we will get rid of covenants on land. We will accept a code of conduct. Some of these changes are already in train. They also know that there are going to be eyes on them. We are going to progress recommendations around regulatory oversight so that we have another full set of eyes across the sector to see that material change is happening. And if it's not happening, then we'll consider other measures.
Minister, once all the public's been told, competition's not working, kind of with the fuel market study, things will get better once recommendations are taken up. It seems like today some reaction has been disappointment that we aren't looking at things that may be outside the study, such as GST-free basic items like other countries have done, or looking at that cost profit of items like meat, the fact that we're paying so much because it's being set by what our export prices are. Are you considering looking into another area on this for actually food prices to come down, or do we risk things like this not actually leading to the change that New Zealanders need? Well,
we are the first government to do these in-depth market studies, and in respect of the fuel one, I do want to say that when that study came out, if we observe fuel margins, you look over the 18 months that followed that study coming out, we know that a family with a 50-litre tank of gas that they fill once a fortnight would have saved, on average, over a year, around $100. There is material change that's happening in response to these things. We know that a new competitor's entered the South Island as a result, they say, of the changes made in response to the fuel market study. So these in-depth studies do have the ability to make material change in the market, and there's a set of recommendations laid out here, which, if they are followed through, I think present a strong case for change will be observed.
So why hasn't anything been done sooner? I mean, this problem with lack of competition has been going on for quite some time. Why now?
Well, I can't answer for previous governments. We've committed to having an in-depth look of things, and now we have robust analysis which says there is not the competition there should be in the sector, and we've got a set of recommendations to improve the sector. So we are acting, and we're determined because we want Kiwis to get a fair price at the checkout.
What sort of impact on prices do you need to see to convince you that the study's having the effect that you expect?
Well, the sector will be monitored, and prices are monitored. There are mechanisms in place currently to see that. In a competitive market, a workably competitive market, you would see profitability for supermarkets go up and down as new competitors come in and out, as they adopt new competitive strategies. What the report observes is that profits have remained consistently high over time. So I'd expect to see a disruption in that pattern for the supermarkets. Doesn't mean to say they won't continue to be profitable enterprises, but we want to see suppliers and consumers and smaller retailers in the sector get a fair deal.
That after 3 years you should review what came out of the study and the responses from today. If there isn't a new entrant or visible new competition in 3 years, will you see all of the responses being announced today as a failure?
I don't want to wait 3 years before we see action. I'll be considering that recommendation clearly. If the recommendations proposed don't achieve the level of competition that we need, I will consider further measures.
Do you believe these measures are enough? Do you believe that these measures are enough to actually see a major rival set up in New Zealand? Do you believe that will happen at this point?
The Commission believes that they are. And they also canvass in their report the plans of Costco coming to New Zealand, already planning to be in Auckland, looking at Wellington and Christchurch. They look at the strategy of players like Aldi. I'm aware the Warehouse is slowly growing its offering. And I think that if the changes they bring to the table here are adopted and implemented, their thesis that there'll be a material change is likely. But as I say, the proof is in the pudding, and I want to see a material change, and I am, if I don't see that, then I am prepared to consider further measures.
So are you concerned, though, that after today, after the fuel study, now after this, what may be, to many people, an underwhelming kind of conclusion in the study, that the public might look at the Commerce Commission, might look at these market studies, and frankly lose confidence in their ability to actually improve their lives in a real way?
Look, I think this is too important an issue not to get right on behalf of consumers, and so we'll be taking the measures that are required. Look, there are arguments either way on some of those kites that were flown in the draft report, but we will consider further measures if we don't see material improvements in competition in the sector. Hamish.
Tell us these other measures that you might consider, will you? I mean, the Commerce Commission has more or less said that, you know, creating an independent wholesaler could lead to a loss of efficiency and isn't sustainable. So what are you going to do if they don't do it?
Look, we'll come back with responses to the detailed recommendations in coming weeks. I want to have legislation in the House this year, so we're going to come back with detailed responses to the recommendations. For now, I want to be really clear that we accept the findings, that competition is not working, that consumers could be getting a better deal, and that things need to change in the sector. And that range of recommendations laid out makes clear that there is quite substantial change that can happen, that's quite practical to happen. And we want to make sure that we understand how it will happen as government and be confident that that will achieve the change we want to see.
Still, but you have said several times that you'll consider other measures if you don't get the outcome you want. What are the range of other measures that are potentially on the table if you don't get the results that you expect to see?
Well, look, our starting position is the recommendations in the report. But I'm not ruling out other options, and I don't want to go into the detail of those other options until we as government have worked them through. We've just received, the public's seen the report today. I've had the report over the weekend to consider. We need to work through and make sure that our response is clear and will achieve the goal of making sure that consumers get a better deal at the checkout.
Clark, what is the Commerce Commission likely to be the new supermarket regulator?
Look, that is a conversation for another day. They already have a good track record in having commissioners who lead work. I think it's the telecommunications sector immediately. And so I guess that will be one of the options that will be considered. But in the UK, they've got a standalone regime. We'll look at those options and work out what we think is going to achieve the best results.
Profits earlier, Commerce Commission brought up profits. Will you be looking at the big duopolies profits over the coming years, and if they don't come down, that will be a sign of that this hasn't worked?
Yeah, if we see continued high returns, consistent and unchanging, that tends to reflect the fact that there are not competitive pressures coming in and out of the market. And so we will be looking closely at the returns to the sector. And if we're not seeing changes there, if we're not seeing more competition at the checkout, if we're not seeing growth in the smaller retailers or bigger retailers coming in, if we're not seeing material changes in the sector, then we will consider other measures. And I should say for completeness, for example, it's argued both ways in the report. Divestment, that is something we will consider, but I'm not ruling that in or out at this stage as one of the responses.
Minister, the Health Coalition Aotearoa has come out today with expressing disappointment. They say that these measures don't go far enough for our low socio-economic households that may only have access to a corner store with less healthy food, higher prices, disproportionately also affecting Māori and Pacifica, who we are trying to improve health outcomes for. What do you say to that, and are you considering any actually food-based policies to make healthy food cheaper and to increase access to that for these communities?
Well, I would argue on my reading of the report that those corner stores, one of the things that's put forward, one of the major findings, is that access to the wholesale arms of the major grocery retailers would mean that you would have a wider range of healthy products at cheaper prices at the corner store. That is one of the central theses in the report as laid out by the Commerce Commission, and it's one that I want to see happen. I want to see access to reasonably priced wholesale supplies. How that happens is something that we'll be working through.
Do you think this will lead to that in places like the Four Squares?
Look, it may be the competition to Four Squares. It may be Four Squares themselves. Four Squares already have access to that wholesale network through being members of the Foodstuffs group. There are other competitors in the market already at the fringes who don't have access to that wholesale supply, and the report argues that they ought to be able to compete in the market.
Considering any food-based policies and like looking into a further study on this in the future?
No.
The interim report, suggested the Commission was minded to recommend major structural change. Now we've had, meaningful change, but not quite the same. Do you think that was tactically a mistake?
I think the Commerce Commission laid out a range of possible responses based on the information they had. They received further information, and in the report itself, they lay out the argument why they think setting up, for example, a government-backed wholesaler or another wholesaler of that type would not work in the market. And they argue that it just simply wouldn't be a sustainable model because around the world, the big grocery retailers strive for vertical integration. They might use access to wholesale as a leg up, but they wouldn't sustainably access it. And nor, if they turned up as small retailers wanting to expand, could they sustain another wholesale unit because it requires scale and consistent scale to achieve the savings that wholesalers can achieve. So that's why they come up with the suggestion of access to the existing major grocery retailers' wholesale arms. I think it's a compelling case, but I want to make sure that it happens.
To what degree do you think a bunch of these changes could be overrun, I guess, by the march of technology over the next 5 years? A lot more people ordering stuff to be delivered at home or to pick up that might kind of bypass these changes. There seems to be very much a focus on kind of bricks and mortar supermarket retail instead of perhaps a more diversifying sector.
The Commission itself canvasses this issue and says there is some innovation happening in the sector at the margins. At this stage, they don't believe it's of a scale to be disruptive. That New Zealanders prefer to do a major shop, possibly two, each week at a major grocery retailer because of the range of options, because they can interact with themselves with the fruit and veggies, the produce, because they can see the whole layout and do the comparison easily. But they do note that there is innovation happening, and that's one of the arguments they make for having a review further down the track. As new innovation comes in, as different business models come to play in the sector, the major grocery retailers themselves say this is something they have an eye to. They do see the made ready-to-eat meals and other things nipping at their heels, and they are responding to that as well. So I think change is inevitable, but at this stage the Commerce Commission finds that challenge is not material enough to disrupt things, to give the greater competition that consumers actually need at the checkout. Okay, I'll take any more. Thank you very much.